Hello, my name is Dr. Brian Raid, and I'm a naturopathic doctor, and this is part 2 in my video series talking about tests to consider when striving to biohack. So in case you didn't watch part 1 or you're not familiar with what biohacking is, essentially it's the sort of concept of taking someone who's already healthy, feeling good in general, and just striving to further improve how they feel, maybe aiming for superhuman status, or maybe to like a less extreme extent, just doing some testing to make sure that when a person's feeling good, just to make sure that on paper they're looking healthy as well. So kind of checking our work, so to speak. So the second test I want to talk about, or that I'm going to talk about, is genomic testing. So genomic testing is essentially where your DNA is tested. So you generally will send in a saliva sample to a company that will then from that extract your genetic code, like your genetic data essentially, and then that is usually distilled down into a little zip file that has your entire genetic code in it. So all of the A's and T's and C's and G's that basically make up our DNA. And then another company will, or sometimes the same company, will run that data through a gene decoder program and will tell you about the status of various genes in your body. So for example, it might, one gene that's oftentimes tested, and it's probably the most talked about gene in the world of genomics, is the MTHFR gene, which stands for methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase. And so with that MTHFR gene, from your raw genetic data, one of these gene decoder programs will tell you, does that gene look very average, meaning that it doesn't have mutations in it that would differentiate it from an average gene, or does it have mutations at certain key locations along the length of that gene that might ultimately influence its function, or more specifically, because genes ultimately code for proteins that do all the work in our body. So whether it's an enzyme or some other type of protein, if there's a mutation, then the protein or the enzyme that's created from that gene won't work properly. It will generally, sometimes mutations actually make the proteins or enzymes work a little bit better, but for the most part, it usually interferes with their function and they just don't work as well or as efficiently. So my phone dropped in the last video as well. I really have to rethink my propping up here. I have it propped up on my microscope that's on my desk, and anyways, usually it works just fine, but maybe somebody put some butter on it or something, I don't know. So anyways, with say that MTHFR gene, for example, a report would tell you, at a certain key location along that gene, are there no mutations? Bearing in mind we have 2 copies of every gene, one from mom, one from dad. So are both copies non-mutated, or is one copy mutated, the other one's not, or both copies are mutated? So in the case of an MTHFR gene, if both copies are mutated, then that enzyme only works at 30% of its optimal capacity on average. And so that can lead to a lot of problems because the MTHFR gene is involved in neurotransmitter synthesis and metabolism. It's involved in glutathione production. It's involved in homocysteine production. It's involved in sulfur metabolism. It's involved in a whole whack of different things, histamine metabolism, the list goes on and on. And so that knowing about the genetic status of, say, that MTHFR gene is useful, because if we then see that, oh, this person is feeling good, feeling healthy right now, but we know that they have that genetic predisposition in this case, or maybe not being able to methylate as well, well, maybe that will inspire us to run a methylation profile and see how the level of some of the various metabolites that are involved in their methylation cycle are looking. Or we may look at that and see, well, during times of stress, you may want to consider taking some extra methylfolate, which is ultimately the end product that the MTHFR enzyme creates. And so that can be useful advice for some people. So by looking at these genomic profiles, we get information not just about methylation cycle markers, like MTHFR is just one of them. There's the MTR, MTRR, the MAT, the AHCY, the BHMT. There's a whole bunch of different genes. And so we not only get information around the methylation cycle, which is very important, as I've kind of made a point of here, but also other genes that have to do with our neurotransmitter metabolism, like say COMT or the MAOA gene, or genes, or things related to antioxidant production. That's an area that I'm really fascinated by. So there's a whole whack of genes on these genetic reports that will tell us about the function or the integrity, if you will, of the genes that regulate glutathione production, catalase production, superoxide dismutase production, peroxinase production, and then some of these master control switches of antioxidant expression in the first place, something called KEAP1 and NERF2. So we've learned about antioxidant status in that way. These genetic profiles, depending on the company that's used, will tell us about a person's what's called ApoE status, which is related to their ability to utilize fat from the diet, either in a healthful way or an unhealthful way, or their relative risk of developing Alzheimer's over the course of time. There are genes that look at histamine metabolism specifically. There are genes that look at what else do these reports look at? Sulfur metabolism, iron utilization, whether a person's more prone to sequestering iron or not. So there's a whole bunch of different areas of our physiology that are looked at with these tests. And what's important to note is that, or to be aware of, is that these genetic tests, they don't give us an insight on like the level of any of these antioxidants or neurotransmitters or what have you. They just tell us about the genetic predispositions to maybe having, better or worse levels of various things, or more predisposition to this or that condition. And so just being aware of that in a person who's already healthy, I think is very useful, because again, it might inspire us to say, oh wow, you've got a lot of mutations around your antioxidant producing genes. So maybe we should look at doing some testing to measure some markers of your antioxidant status to see how that's looking. Or again, it could tell us that, well, in times of stress, if we know like, yeah, you feel good, but every time you're around somebody who's wearing like perfume or cologne, which are also known as, stinky toxic chemicals, no offense to anybody listening who likes the smell of cologne or perfume, but they are stinky toxic chemicals. It's like, oh, you get a headache every time you're around that. Well, you should probably take some antioxidants, and maybe take some glutathione, or maybe take some vitamin E, because that is the reason you're having that headache. Could very well be because you don't make antioxidants as efficiently as you ideally should, and therefore, as another person might, and therefore you can't detoxify those stinky toxic chemicals as quickly as the average person might be able to, so they build up and cause a headache until you flush them out of your body, for example. So there can be some really useful clues that we can determine around a number of different aspects of a person's physiology. When it comes to this testing, there are quite a few companies nowadays that at the very least offer offer the gene decoder software. So there's a whole whack of different options there, like probably at least a dozen of them that I've seen. I'm sure there's others that I haven't seen. And then there's a few different companies that will actually do the testing of the saliva, or sometimes blood, to actually get the raw genetic data to run through those gene decoder programs. The systems that I like to use, and I have no financial affiliation with them whatsoever, but generally we use 23andme.com to get and I'm not sure if that's available in the States or not. I think some of my US colleagues told me once upon a time that it wasn't available there anymore. We can definitely get it in Canada though. So I recommend that one because it is a very cost-effective one. It's a good idea if you're considering doing this to talk to someone, or think about just the privacy implications of having your raw genetic data in the hands of a private company. And so that's something just to be aware of, and there's certain workarounds with that I talk to my patients about. And then in terms of gene decoder programs, the system that I like to use is it's run by a company called the Genomic Research Institute. I think their website is dnasupplementation.com or something like that. It's only available through clinicians, so if anyone's thinking they're going to go do their own biohacking, which all the power to you if you can do that in a safe, responsible way. You can't access it without doing it through a clinic. But the reason I like them so much is because they give us this beautiful 65-page report, tells us about every gene we could conceivably want to know about, and it's very targeted towards health optimization in terms of screening for all the different things that I mentioned that some of the other some of the other reports out there don't present on. There are a number of systems out there that use quite a bit of extrapolation. I don't think that all of the claims that are made by every gene decoder reporting system are 100% reliable. It's it's fine to have that information out there, but there are some leaps I think that are made where it's like, oh, you have this gene, so therefore you should definitely eat this food or avoid that food or this or that. I think there's a lot of liberties that are taken by some companies. But anyway, so that's just the system that I use. And again, I have no financial interest in either one. You can do whatever you so choose, or if you're a clinician, use whatever works for you. But that's the system that I like the best because we get the most data, and it's also got a really good price point. I mean, in Canadian dollars, it's about $200 or so, give or take, which is not insignificant, but there are other reports. Like a patient I was consulting with today was mentioning one, and we were looking at the website together, and it's like, $400 US, and we were like, wow, that's quite a bit more, especially with the exchange rate not favoring our poor little Canadian dollar. So anyways, I hope that this information is useful. I apologize for the extremely long video. I thought this would be a 2-minute one, and I'm almost at 11 minutes. So anyways, I hope this is useful, and I will post about something else in the biohacking realm and other tests to consider as soon as I'm able to.